The position of point guard is one that can mean many different things to many different people. Depending on what era you come from and who you're asking, you're going to get all sorts of different answers. But one thing I think we could all agree on is that this position has greatly changed over the years and especially over the decades. So today in this video, we're going to take a look at the evolution of the point guard position, how it's adapted over the decades alongside the game of basketball itself, and some players I think do a fantastic job of representing each stage of the position's evolution. The NBA's first great point guard, Bob Cousy, came very early on in the league's history. Cousy was drafted 3rd overall in the 1950 draft, just the NBA's 4th ever season. And although it's the funny and popular thing to make fun of players from this era on social media,
he also had 29 assists in an NBA game.
Oh, well, you know, he was being guarded by plumbers and firemen.
Oh, come on.
That is true.
Yeah.
That is true.
when you look at history, Cousy really was ahead of his time. The NBA really did have a poor product when Cousy entered the league, outside of George Mikan and the Minneapolis Lakers. And Cousy throughout the 1950s did much to elevate that with his flashy passes and his creativity on the floor. We have to remember that at this point, basketball had only been invented 60 years ago. There were weird rules that limited the way you could dribble, and guys were still figuring out how to shoot the ball correctly. I mean, just take a moment and watch some of these highlights. His vision on the court is incredible. Some of these passes are absurd. Yes, a couple of them are a little silly, maybe a little extra, but the passes he's making in real time are impressive. And he's pushing the pace, running the fast break in an era that you didn't really see much of that. Although he did have his limitations in athleticism and size, being only 6'1" and 175 pounds, he would be the catalyst throughout the 1950s on those incredible Celtics teams that would pave the way for more athletically gifted players than himself for years to come. Speaking of athletically gifted players, it didn't take long for one to enter the league at the point guard position. In the 1961 NBA draft, Oscar Robertson was selected 1st overall to the Cincinnati Royals, and although he was one of the greatest point guards in the history of the game, at the time, he didn't look like one. Standing at 6'5" and 205 pounds, there's a reason that he was nicknamed Big O. Although Oscar could do everything that NBA coaches would ask a point guard to do in the 60s, be the leader of the team, coach on the floor, and facilitate the offense, he was also able to do so much more than that, becoming the first player ever in NBA history to average a triple-double in only his 2nd season in the NBA. It was such an advantage to have an athletic point guard who could score as well as Oscar could, as most NBA rosters just didn't have that type of roster construction. Oscar really was ahead of his time and would have fit super well into the modern NBA. It's safe to say that he was the first NBA point guard to prove that you could score at an elite level and still be a point guard. Outside of Robertson, the 60s and the 70s didn't have a ton of what I would call evolution in the point guard position. However, there are 3 players I would like to mention before we move to the 1980s. Firstly, the greatest point guard of the 70s, Walt Frazier. While Walt wasn't as dominant of a scorer as Oscar Robertson was, he still was a bigger point guard at 6'4", a tenacious defender, an incredible facilitator, still an above average scorer, and he would lead the Knicks to 2 championships in the decade in 1970 and 1972. Secondly, you have Pistol Pete Maravich, who some would call a shooting guard for portions of his career, but we're calling him a point guard for purposes of this video. Pete was a prolific scorer in his day, also an incredible shooter. I can't imagine what his career would look like if he would have played with a 3-point line, but more than anything, Pete Maravich played with a certain style of creativity and fluidity that you wouldn't see in the 50s or the 60s. And lastly, we have a point guard that gets forgot about far too often, Nate Tiny Archibald. He went on to average 34 points and 11.4 assists in his 3rd NBA season for the Kansas City Kings. As luck would have it, Bob Cousy was his coach, and Nate was a lot different than the other 2 point guards I just mentioned. Although he was listed at 6'1", most people believe he was closer to 5'10". He played a completely different style of basketball than Oscar Robertson, Walt Frazier, or Pete Maravich did, and he showed that with his quickness, his passing, and his ability to score, there was still a place for shorter point guards in the NBA. As great and as influential as every point guard we've mentioned so far in this video have been to the evolution of the position, nobody comes remarkably close to that of Magic Johnson. Standing at 6'9", Magic entered the league in 1979 as a bit of a unicorn. He still embodied all of the traits that made a point guard incredible. The ability to make magnificent passes, the ability to score when asked to, the ability to lead your team and be a winner, but he was doing all of that at the size of an NBA center. So much so that in his rookie season in the NBA Finals with Kareem hurt, Magic would play the center position.
Are you going to play center on offense in this game?
Yeah, I will be changing from center to forward. On certain plays, depending what play we call, I will be playing from center and forward.
Going on to score 42 points, have 15 rebounds, and put up 7 assists, defeating the 76ers in 6 games. Outside of three-point shooting, there really wasn't anything that Magic couldn't do, and he could do it at such a higher level given his athletic ability and his size. The 90s didn't necessarily evolve the point guard position, but we do have a couple players I have to mention before we get to the 2000s. First off, John Stockton is the greatest point guard of the 1990s, a point guard in its purest form. He would run the offense, facilitate, and he was able to shoot as well, which helped a ton. And then we have Isaiah Thomas. While he's technically the 1980s, maybe the early 90s, if Magic Johnson does not exist, Isaiah Thomas is the greatest point guard of the 1980s. At 6'1", a very different game than Magic, he was very fast, very quick, able to get to the rim, and had one of the best handles in NBA history. Of course, there's some other great point guards of the 80s and the 90s that were left out from this video, but it's the 2000s where we really start seeing a change of pace at the position. And as incredible as Jason Kidd was in the early 2000s, it was really Steve Nash that revolutionized the point guard position in the mid-2000s. But Steve can't take the credit for all of it. The NBA had some rule changes take place in the mid-2000s that would open up the game more, allow for less hand checking on defense, plus they added a defensive 3 seconds in the paint to the game. Not many people know this, but the Suns GM was on the committee David Stern put together to open up the game more, and because of that, the Suns were ready for these rule changes. Their coach, Mike D'Antoni, came out with what he called the 7 seconds or less offense.
That offense was nicknamed the 7 seconds or less Suns.
He was ahead of his time, wasn't he?
Which is exactly how it sounds. Their goal was to get a shot off in 7 seconds or less.
Obviously, it's because of what you can do. Sean can guard a 4, Mari could kill 5s, and it's like, why wouldn't we do it?
Because of the rule changes, defense was now harder, and Steve Nash helped revolutionize the point guard position, winning back-to-back MVPs at the helm of this fast-paced, fast-break offense. During the same season that Steve Nash won his second MVP, there was another point guard with a completely different style of play that was also making waves around the league, and that was 24-year-old Gilbert Arenas. Playing for the Washington Wizards, Arenas would put up a stat line that season of 29.3 points per game, 6.1 assists, and 3.5 rebounds. And when you contrast that with Steve Nash's stat line that season of 18.8 points per game, 10.5 assists, and 4.2 rebounds, you can see there's a big difference between the two. Matter of fact, the next highest points per game in the NBA that season from a different point guard was Mike Bibby with 21.1. Arenas really was the beginning of a long line of point guards throughout the 2010s and even into the modern day that were shoot first, create second. Two names that come to mind when I think about this style of point guard would be Kyrie Irving and Damian Lillard. As we move into the 2010s, this is, in my opinion, the decade where the point guard position changed the most. And you could almost say that as it was evolving, it was forking into many different styles of point guard play. You still had more prototypical point guards like Tony Parker, Chris Paul, Rajon Rondo, Deron Williams. They weren't the most athletically gifted. They would look to score second, and they were great facilitators. And then, like I said before, you have they shoot first, the score first point guards in Kyrie Irving and Damian Lillard. And then you had a third type of point guard pop up during this decade, the athletic freak. Two players that would exhibit this perfectly would be Derrick Rose and Russell Westbrook. May not have been the greatest pure scorers or pure shooters. They also may not have been the greatest facilitators, but they were absolutely relentless and could get to the rim at will. The last type of point guard to pop up in this decade is truly one of a kind, and in my opinion, is the greatest evolution in the position in the history of the game, and that's Stephen Curry. In the mid-2010s, the Golden State Warriors absolutely revolutionized the way that the game of basketball is being played. Even though the Suns teams of the early 2000s had shadows of this a decade earlier, the overall quality of the shooting in the 2010s was a lot higher. In the 2015-2016 regular season, at the age of 27, Stephen Curry attempted 11.2 threes per game, making 45% of them, which is absolutely unthinkable at any other point in NBA history. To have a point guard with unlimited range and the ability to pull up from anywhere is such an advantage and something the NBA had never seen before. Couple that together with small ball, insane ball movement, and incredible shooting in Klay Thompson and others, others, and you get the greatest regular season team of all time, the 2016 73-9 Warriors. During this time period, the NBA was coming out of the isolation play of the 90s and 2000s, alongside the difficult back down mid-range jumpers that players like Kobe Bryant and Michael Jordan loved taking in favor of easy twos or open threes. And this 100% affected the point guard position, Stephen Curry being the greatest microcosm of that. But the evolution of the point guard position was not just about Stephen Curry. As profound and as influential as he has been for the position, it really was something the league dealt with as a whole. As we move further into the late 2010s and the early 2020s, gone were the days of the pure point guards, the John Stocktons, players that were pass first, score second, and instead you'd have players handling the ball that were shooting guards or more scorers than anything else. We now have in 2023 what some call positionless basketball, with Nikola Jokic running point as a center facilitating, Luka Doncic point forwarding at 6'9", or even point guards who are pure scorers like Kyrie Irving. Clippers coach Tyronn Lue said it best: "You've seen the game kind of transition from the Stocktons and Mark Prices and Magic Johnsons to guys who became score-oriented. Now you put a guy out there with a bunch of shooters, and it doesn't really even matter what his position is. As long as you've got guys who can make plays and got shooting on the floor, it's all the same." I also love this quote from Pelicans assistant coach Darren Erman: "More people are complete basketball players than ever before. So many more players are skilled. Before, players were put in specific roles. This guy was a shooting guard, this guy was a point guard. It's not like that anymore." To me, those two quotes are a perfect way to sum up the state of the point guard position in 2023. You have guys like James Harden, who lead the league in assists in 2017 and then lead the league in scoring for the next 3 seasons, all the while technically being a shooting guard. Positionless basketball is just a more effective way to play the game in 2023 in a league where athleticism and shooting matters more than ever. Today's modern day game, you can't really have guys with liabilities like shooting or athleticism running point for you. Instead, you'd rather just prefer having good shooters who can play defense and space the floor. I'll be super interested to see what the NBA looks like 10 years from now, but the evolution of the point guard position is really just a microcosm of the evolution of how the game of basketball is played. We did see some holes in the positionless basketball way of playing this year at the FIBA World Cup. While Team USA had the most athletic guys on the court, they still lost rather handedly in the semifinals of the tournament to a specific role and position-based Germany team. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, you'll enjoy the video below on why 2016 is so legendary for basketball. It's basically a nostalgic video recapping the greatest NBA season of all time. Thanks for watching, and as always, we'll see you on the hardwood.